Graham was one of the major forces in dance in the 20th century. She essentially revolutionized dance by introducing entirely new ways of moving, entirely new subject matter and dynamics, and then eventually created an entire dance technique for training dancers that had not existed before. She created works about subject matter that usually was avoided in the theater. People went to the theater for entertainment and to get away from their problems. And she created dance works that went deeply into human conditions. She was interested in revealing what she called as the inner landscape, of exploring the deeper, more difficult emotions, perhaps. Love, which is wonderful, but also has its complications, and jealousy and fear and pain and all manner of other experiences that humans have. And she sought a language of movement that would express this in a really honest way, and that then evolved into her dance technique. So yeah, it was quite a big shift in the world of dance when she introduced these concepts. I never heard that she intended to create a dance technique, never. It was only a result of her exploration into these ways of moving. She did talk about, there are films of her talking about her exploration of movement, finding a new language that was authentic and that spoke from deep within in a very genuine way. And also, it's also very well known that her choreography itself created the need for a training method. So in choreographing, she would then devise exercises to teach her dancers how to do the movement she choreographed. And so many of these things then became part of the classroom technique. So I think they went together, that it was the choreography that then generated a need for exercises, but also her exploration of how the body moves. Because the Martha Graham technique is extremely organic in the sense of how it works on how the body's already built. I don't think she was thinking that way ahead, like, oh, I'm going to create a modern dance. In fact, the name of the Martha Graham School is the Martha Graham Center of Contemporary Dance. So this was before contemporary dance existed, because contemporary came after modern, postmodern, postmodern, and whatever else, and then came contemporary. But contemporary only means right now. And so for her, she was doing contemporary dance. In other words, it wasn't a dance form that had a lineage of many generations and many decades like ballet or other classical forms that have a longer lineage. This was dance right now, today, about humans right now, today, contemporary. And also, it was the beginning of the 20th century, so the Industrial Revolution had happened. It was before, the Great Depression was about to happen, hadn't happened yet. World War I had happened. So there were a lot of things happening that were changing the world. Electricity, cars, massive changes, really. And it was throwing people off. People were even though many of these things were good, it still creates a disturbance inside people. Massive change is, stressful. She was aware, very sensitive to these things, and felt that a new form of expression was necessary to reflect what was happening now, today, contemporary life. That the world today could no longer be expressed through these old forms. And it wasn't just dance, it was all art forms. And you see, it was the early 20th century, it was a huge movement in all art forms. We're going through these massive changes. The early decades of the 20th century brought all these changes, and she was one of those among that group. So I think it was her intention to find an art form in movement, in dance, that would reflect what was happening today, contemporary. And I think later, a little bit later, they started to be called the moderns. She and the others in that generation that were exploring, Humphrey Weidman, Limon, eventually Cunningham, and others, because they were of the day today. They weren't reenacting something from the past. The full name is Sketches from Chronicle, 1914. So there's reference to the First World War in the title of the piece. That is the biggest influence on the piece. It's kind of the reflections on what war does to people. And actually the piece originally had 5 sections. There were 2 more that have been lost, that there is no record of and were not therefore reconstructed. So what remains are 3 sections. The first being a solo called Spectre, that is sort of the prelude to war, and this character sort of represents the frightening and overpowering, overwhelming force of war, that when it's coming, there's no stopping it. It's a death machine, and the horror of that. The second section is called Steps in the Street, Devastation, Homelessness, Exile, and it is the aftermath of war, what it does to people, the loss of spirit, the devastation, the sense of isolation and loss of hope that occurs. And then the third section is called Prelude to Action, and it is a sense of rejuvenation, the beginnings of recovery, the rallying of spirit and as a community to persevere and try to come back and renew one's life, begin again. My understanding always was that Martha Graham wasn't particularly interested in creating political dance, that one can read political messages in it, but that the dance most of the time, if not all, in all of my experience with the Graham work, is that it was about the human condition in a more intimate sense. That it was about the spirit, the inner, as she called it, the inner landscape, those realities and those reflections that would be depicted in her work. I think, sadly, Chronicle is still very timely in the world today for its messages that are very powerful and very resonant in the world today. I think the rise of fascism in Europe was an influence, and she did have a reaction to that was actually more literal than in her dances, which is she refused to perform in Germany during the era of Hitler because they refused her Jewish members' entrance, to be included. So she declined an invitation to perform there because of that. It's more abstract. In other words, there's not a plot, there's not a storyline, and there aren't really characters. There are figures. There's the character or figure who does Spectre, and she becomes a representation of war. But it's not a character with a name or a story. And the same goes for the rest of the piece. Yes, the principles of the technique revolve around the very organic way that we breathe, that we move, that our body language tells our state of being. So, for example, in her youth, Martha Graham's father was a psychiatrist, and he told her once that he could tell that she was lying. And she wondered, how did he know? And she said, your body language told me that you were lying. And so she said that was her first dance lesson. So her technique developed along the way that our bodies naturally express themselves. So the primary elements are contraction and release, which are a reflection of breathing. Inhale, the body is lifted and full, and exhale, the body empties out and becomes hollow. And this then is a full range of emotional expressions right there. And then depending how you use them, the speed, the dynamics, the position of the body, it just opens up so many possibilities of expression. So besides contraction and release, she also explored the way that we naturally turn and spiral in our lives to have balance, and also as a way of using three-dimensional space, turning around our own spine. So the spiral was something that she also introduced in a really codified dance language form. Shift of weight was another thing, that falling and really allowing gravity and the sense of weight to be an integral part of the movement was another thing that she and other modern innovators at the time explored very deeply, the use of shift of weight. And also allowing the effort to be visible. So a lot of the dance that existed up until that point tried to show effortlessness and ease. And with Graham, she really embraced the sense of the effort and struggle, because again, this was a tool to show the inner landscape of the human who was struggling and perhaps suffering. That it was another way to evoke that in a very authentic way, was to really use those principles of movement, yeah, as a reflection.
Kurt Jooss developed, he was interested in contemporary dance, but then later on he got interested in the classical way of movement, the classical dance. So he wanted to combine the two techniques of the contemporary and the classical, so he developed what the dance expressionism, Ausdruckstanz. So, and he wanted to combine this and also the element of drama in a dance piece. So drama through the movement of dance. And so this is what the green table has gelled together, those two techniques. And so he developed that as the time went on, and just the way the body moves in space, and also doing less but expressing more through how you do the movement. Well, he did many which do not exist anymore, but there are a few that one could still do. That's Pavane on the Death of an Infanta, and it's the Big City, and Ball in Old Vienna really is a bit more old-fashioned, but one could do it, and the Green Table, of course, is the most famous. The way this came into being was, first he had the idea only to make the solo of Death for himself, because he was so fascinated. He saw at the Lübecker Tanz, there was a mural of how death took different victims, old, rich, poor, young, and bishops, whatever. He was fascinated with how each victim was taken and in a different way. So the death figure became his idea, like the medieval dances of death. Death danced with his victims, some of them before. And so this is what he made. But then he had an injury, from what I understand, and so he had to put that on hold. And then he had this idea after the First World War about the futility of war, of why do you even have a war? It doesn't help anything, it just kills people and displaces people. And so he was a pacifist, totally against war, and he just wanted to depict this, to show this narrative in the Green Table. So that's why he has this, the politicians negotiating to go to war, or rich men who have influence, and they don't actually go to war themselves, but they argue, yes we should, no we shouldn't, and at the end they shoot their pistols saying, yes, we're going to war. And then you have all the scenes showing what happens when people go to war. You have it's really reality, and it's actual. History does repeat itself. over and over. And the green table, you know, it's an international color. I don't know if you've seen it in different cabinets or governments. They still have green. It's supposed to be international negotiating ground, neutral. So you shouldn't really kill anybody there because it's neutral. It's not territory. Yes, well, I mean, it was a major breakthrough, and it touched people because they had the First World War, because a green table was made in 1932, so between the two world wars, but he didn't know there would be a second one, of course. But after that, it made an impression on him, and plus he was forced out of Germany, actually, because he would not fire the Jewish people in his company. And they were actually on his doorstep, the Gestapo, but somebody warned them the night before, and they got out. They went to, I think they went to Holland, and they went on tour. Everyone just left the country just in time, otherwise. And they also, in the end, they started to work in Darlington, in England, Darlington Hall in England. So that's where they had their base afterwards. And many years later, Kurt Jooss came back to Germany. So it started in Essen, the Folkwangschule, which still exists, actually. I danced this piece in 1978. I was the partisan woman, calling everybody for the cause. Come on! Yes, yeah, it's a very special piece. Everyone who has ever done it says so. Years later, also, they have enjoyed it so much. It's also a learning process because, especially these days, they have all these contemporary works where the legs are here and there, and it's sharp, kind of thrown and a movement like this. But green table is so held, so controlled. Sometimes it's harder to stand still or just move only your eyes, just looking. So hard, and some people just go this way or that. You have to pull it, take in the whole focus and use the whole phrase, or some phrases, and then you go. The musicality is wonderful, and the actual intensity and the intention of the characters, of how they look and where they look and how they move. And so I've done many productions, and I worked with Anna Marquardt, who was the daughter of Kurt Jooss. She set over 50 productions. I worked with her for 15 years before she passed. So I learned, and what she taught was what her father wanted, Kurt Jooss, so Papa Jooss. She said, Papa, what do you want here exactly? Because sometimes you let dancers do a little more this, a little more, but it'll change the element, like an extra twist doesn't say the same thing as just in one direction. So she said, what do you want here? And that's the version she taught, and that's the one I learned from her, and that's what I teach. Very strict, it has to be like this and nothing else. It is what it is. So that also makes it very disciplined. And it's nice for me too, wherever I go, I have to analyze differently for different companies. Yeah, it's just, it's really interesting how it was developed and how it was written in dance Laban notation, it's called, because Rudolf Laban invented this dance notation. And Kurt Jooss, they actually worked together, but it's called Laban notation. And it's all written down, and for reference I see that too. And that's also really interesting to see. It even says even which finger and how many and where you look. It has all the directions, everything with the body, how the body is up or down. And but just learning all of that through the years, I don't know, it's an enrichment is what it is, yeah. And I think back, oh yeah, it's wonderful. I enjoy it every time, no matter how much I've done it. Yeah, but he had the different characters for that reason, so it gave it color also. And for the drama, to tell the story, you have to have the different figures with the profiteer, the old mother, the partisan woman, the young girl, the young soldier, the old soldier. So it all makes it's a teamwork, and it all is for one cause, to say one thing. But the human element, indeed, it can be aggressive, or it could be very tender, or just military, or, you know, it has all these different, it's complex, especially for the death role, very complex. And it's also the music. Music was made in close collaboration with Kurt Jooss. That's Fritz Cohen, F.A. Cohen. They worked very closely together to make also the atmosphere of the scene. So it all comes together to make it even more dramatic. Yeah, it's just all the elements put together, and the lighting, how it's done. And it's made for 2 pianos also. And actually, it originally was made for 1 piano, but it was, he choreographed the ballet for competition in Paris, for the international choreographic competition. And they said, no, you need an orchestra. So they added another piano, and there was your orchestra. Yeah, they accepted that.